presentation will be a little different than what you have been hearing because I don't have an overhead. I don't have the PowerPoint. I'm hoping that we can be a bit more interactive. Are you having trouble hearing? Okay, now can you hear me better?
Yes.
All right. But I'm glad you did that because I would like, with our session, short though it is, for you to be communicating with me just as I'm communicating with you. Let me quickly give you my background. I'm a professor at Our Lady of the Lake University in the Wharton School of Social Service. And that means that I teach social work at the undergraduate and graduate level. And I've done this for more years than I could tell you, over 25. I've also done private practice for those same number of years. And I've now, for the past 8 years, been focusing especially on ethical issues, both teaching it in my classes, but also doing workshops. Now that's who I am. I heard from one of your instructors that there are a lot of dental hygienists here today. Could I see, how many dental hygienists do we have? All right. And what other professions are represented?
The Alzheimer's Association.
All right, welcome. Is there anyone else in the room? Okay. How many people, besides being in the course this week, are in a degree program of some kind? Meaning you haven't completed your dental hygienist training. Okay. That helps me to know where to put the discussion. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about values, the relationship of values to ethics, and then the kinds of ethical dilemmas that we as healthcare providers deal with. And for those of you who are dental hygienists, I'm going especially, but the Alzheimer's Society Association as well, will ask for you to help me make the value discussion relevant in terms of case studies, meaning things, experiences that you've had. I'm not going to get into the legalities of value choices because you're going to see later this week, I looked on here, and you're going to have on Wednesday legal issues in geriatrics, and then on Thursday you're going to have a whole session on end-of-life issues, do not resuscitate, directives, and that sort of thing. All right. What that means is that some values in our society have been so strong that they have been translated into legislation, which has become law. But one of the dilemmas that I face, and I would guess that you do, is that the whole area of ethics is not a crisp and clear one. I mean, if there were just a cookbook, you know, where we said, okay, this is the book, it tells you just what to do. But I think you already know, even if you're just in training at this point, that we don't have that. The area is murky, and there are more questions than there are answers. What is important to me is that we ask the questions, which means we maintain a heightened awareness of the ethical dimensions of the different issues that we deal with our clients. Now again, I was saying, as a professional, you are developing a core, or have developed a core of knowledge, skills, and values that together constitute your base for practice as a professional. Only professions have ethical codes. And although the ethical codes vary between dental hygienists and social workers and doctors and nurses, there is a tremendous amount of similarity. Those ethical principles are based on a set of values. And the reason we don't go with broad values, which I do want to talk with you about today, is that they are so general that they really don't give you any direction, like a patient's right to self-determination. Well, that is very far from telling you what to do. So values are translated into ethical standards, which then get encoded in either ethical principles or a statement in social work. It's called the Code of Ethics. You were saying there's the American Dental Hygienist. Is it called Code of Ethics? Yes. Okay. Now, here again, while one might look for certainty, you do have, they are more concrete. But when you come down to day-to-day interaction with your client and in your office or organization, you can't just go and very rarely can you go to that code that says, okay, it tells me what to do and I can do it. So the ability to think through issues is very important. Also important, although we will not focus as much on today, is being very aware of your own value system. Because I'm sure you've learned that it's critical not to impose your personal values on decisions or treatments of the clients. But if you are not aware of those personal values, you're in great danger of doing just that. It's very hard to be aware of them because they are such an intrinsic part of us. Nonetheless, a critical piece of being competent in the ethical area is becoming aware of your own personal values and your own personal issues around those values so that you can bracket them when you encounter a client that is expressing different values than yours. What I gave you on that handout, the first handout, was that statement of knowledge, skills, and values, and then the ethical standards. Then what I did was look at several codes of ethics and value statements, and I attempted to extrapolate healthcare values, what I thought were, this isn't an exhaustive list, but seemed to be critical, that and I listed them here, that they're found in some form or another in any code of ethics. And the first one, which is fairly simple, is to do no harm. And the second one, which is the other side of that, is to act in the patient's best interest. One of the things I want to point out to you about that is that it means more subtle things than deliberately. No one, I would guess, goes into healthcare unless they want to help rather than harm. But that we can inadvertently harm. One way would be acting outside our area of competence. And I think this is a really large one. If you don't have the knowledge or skills to do the procedure that you're either being asked to do, or you are the only dental hygienist in the office and something needs to be done, there is a tendency, at least for social workers, let me transfer that over to where I know clearly, is to feel if something needs to be done, I'll do the best I can because there's no one else to do it. And that can inadvertently lead to harm. So the thing to be aware of in that code is that it is more subtle than, the do no harm is more subtle than it would appear to be. Tied into to acting in regard to the patient's best interest is, as I put, respecting and honoring the client's right to self-determination. And that is a very difficult one in healthcare, and it is, I think, especially difficult when you're working with older adults. What it means is that you are committed to certainly recognizing and, if at all possible, honoring the client's right to self-determination, unless they are unable, because of dementia processes, to act for themselves. But the fact is that's not clear-cut. In fact, Alzheimer's would be an example where people may begin the Alzheimer's disease process and for years and be in and out of coherence either on a daily basis or part of the day or around certain tasks only. So there is a tendency on the part of families, but also healthcare providers, to presume that the person doesn't know what they're doing and to take away, out of a desire to protect, that person's right to self-determination. And the value of client's best interest means that you act with what is termed beneficence, but not with paternalism. And there is a very thin line that crosses over paternalism, meaning that you basically see the client as unable to make decisions for themselves, and so you act from the goodness of your heart on their behalf. But in fact, what we say is that that's not an ethical thing to do unless we are very clear that the client is beyond decision-making ability. And also with that one, again, these really sort of fall one into the other. Protect the client's privacy and honor the patient's right to confidentiality. Well, we're all practicing under HIPAA now, right? And so if you haven't had HIPAA training, I'm sure you're going to have it. And every time our patient comes in, they sign a little form, or at least they sign it once, saying that they understand that their records are confidential, but that they may be shared for insurance purposes, et cetera. And one of the concerns I have is that now that we've got everyone to sign, we have forgotten about what it means, that we will not enforce it, because what it really means, the right to confidentiality, is that we periodically remind people of their right to confidentiality and their right to privacy, and express to them again what is being done with their medical records or their medical information. And every time you do that, you raise a potential problem that someone's going to say, oh, I forgot, well, I don't want that to go to X. But it is our ethical responsibility to do so. And that also the right to privacy and the right to confidentiality involves informed consent, which again is a very murky area. What is informed consent? Can a person who does not verbalize give informed consent? Yes, they can. It is incumbent, it is our ethical responsibility to find a way to communicate with that person and to enable them to give informed consent. So if they are deaf and we do not sign, then we get an interpreter. And if they do not see, then we ask them verbally. Here again, we go back to the person who is in and out of coherence, of lucidity. Once again, we wait and find a time when they are more lucid, and we ask. So in some ways, it slows our work down. See, to do these kinds of things, to respect the rights of clients, slows our work down. And so as you practice, there can be sometimes a tendency to push it aside. And what I would ask on behalf of the integrity of the profession, as well as the valuing of people, which I know we ultimately have, is to keep sensitive to that. That almost every decision that you make, an action that you take in relation to a client, has an ethical piece to it. And again, oftentimes we think that is not the case. The next one is treating the patient with respect and dignity, and that is tied in with appreciation and acceptance of diversity. I think here again, in the abstract, that sounds fine. We treat people with respect and dignity. But what if you encounter, as your patient, someone who appears not to be as hygienic as you are, who has a bad odor, who may have an odor of alcohol, and you may have a real bias against people who are drunk, which is fine, except that this person deserves your respect as well. And that's, I think, when it gets hard. What about the patient who is cranky all the time? Or the patient who is, you feel, being a baby about pain. Again, thinking of dental hygienists. That the patient who, as soon as you touch their mouth, they're going like this. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, come on. Well, again, you can think that to yourself, but you respect that person. And what we now know is that even experiencing of pain is what I call socially constructed, meaning it's not that everyone feels the same about pain. It depends who you are, what your culture is, what your physiological state is, as well as how you express pain. So if you get someone who's really stoical, which is a cultural thing of certain cultures, then you may be sticking the needle right into nerve endings, and they are just, they're not making a sound. Whereas in another culture, it is appropriate to sound when you hurt. And there have been studies of how, I think they studied, the study was done years ago of women in childbirth from different societies, and how differently they had learned to express pain or discomfort. So you need to take into account your patient's culture. And instead of labeling them with a bias, which is, again, the bias is they're just a baby. They don't have any tolerance, and you want them just to buck up. And the other thing is that when we deal with patients, all of these values and ethics that we have, they pick it up. And I think sometimes people think, well, I really hide how disgusted I am by this person or how impatient. But I will tell you, and if you turn it around when you have been impatient, and remember, you pick up every nuance of that person, from how they're handling you, from how they're looking at you. And one of the reasons for that is that you have patients in a relatively powerless position, right? They depend on you to take an action on part of their body. And that powerlessness means they have to be in tune to what you're doing at all times because of the control you have over their life. In a way, it's like with children, and what we know is that children are so dependent on their parents that, you know how you've heard that kids pick up stuff when parents don't even say it. They sort of know. And mom says, I don't show I'm angry. The kid knows it. Why? It's the power differential. It's the same thing. If you are impatient with a patient, they know it. They pick it up. And they may not label it impatient, but they'll say there's something wrong. So it really is challenging for us to, that respect and that appreciation of diversity has to come quite deep. When we have these kinds of dilemmas, bioethicists have developed pyramids to allow us, when we have ethical dilemmas where we don't know what to do, say in terms of what is most important, what should be honored. And legally, that has occurred as well. One of the case study I wanted to bring to you is not probably in any of our areas, but it certainly made the newspaper, and I wrote it up from the newspaper, the Nicolosis case. Is everyone familiar with that? That's that third piece of paper.
Can I change your battery real quick? I'm sorry.
Oh, is
It
it?
died again.
Okay.
Just need the other part.
Look at the case while I'm being recharged.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I would rather be heard, but is it on?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Now you can see with the Nicoloso's case what happened. It's a good example of the complexity. Wait a second. It's an example of the complexity of this ethical area. All right. So basically what happened, as you will read there, is for about 10 years, Mr. Nicolosos, and I think it's a Greek name, and if anyone has a better pronunciation, do you? Anyone? I'm just guessing at that. A retired electrical engineer suffered in a car accident, suffered brain damage. His wife decided to care for him at home in Houston. After many complications and hospital stays, in 2001, 4 years ago, he went into a vegetative state. But he was going through sleep and wake cycles, which means his lower functioning areas of his brain were still functioning in a way. He was put on a feeding tube. February 10th, his feeding tube began to bleed, and he was taken to St. Luke's Hospital in Houston. That night, he went into respiratory arrest and was put on a ventilator to breathe. Now, independent tests by 4 neurologists, again, said that Nicoloso's brain activity was severely compromised. The higher functioning areas of the brain were not working. The lower functioning were severely impaired. Physicians caring for him, and they had a 21-member, which is a very large ethics committee, met and agreed that continuing care would be unethical, inhumane, and medically futile. And they wanted to discontinue life support and advised the family of such. The patient's family acknowledged that he was dying, but were really upset because they felt the hospital was trying to tell them what to do. And they wanted to keep him on a ventilator. Clearly, the family had a chance to meet with the doctors and with the ethics committee. They could not come to an agreement. Nicolosos did not have a written living will, or directives. But his wife said he had always told her he wanted everything possible to be done. The hospital maintained that they were not trying to usurp the family's power. However, by law, in 1999, Texas has the advanced medical directive it's actually to physicians, and I put patients, but physicians, families, or surrogates. And you'll be able to use this later this week as well. I did just go through the major portions. You have a handout of the directive. Physicians and other hospital members cannot be forced to do something they consider to be unethical. And Texas is considered to have a model act for advanced directives that has been used by many other states. The advance directive requires hospitals wait 10 days and allow the family to find another place for the person. And that's where it hit the San Antonio papers, because the family looked, and what they found was Avalon Place here in San Antonio would take Mr. Nicolosos. And he was moved into a 30-bed ventilator-dependent unit. This was March 20th. If you turn your page over, you'll see that on the 31st, he developed pneumonia, went back to the hospital, but this time in San Antonio. There were problems with his feeding tube, and they couldn't get it back in. And so they put him on IV feeding. At that point, the ethics committee at Southeast Baptist here in San Antonio came to the same decision that the St. Luke's had done in Houston. The family disagreed. And this time it was more complicated because Avalon Place normally did not take patients who were being fed intravenously. And so the question was, were they going to stop life support? Well, what finally happened at the last minute was that the person who directs, Joan Dugan, president of the Indiana-based Sage Health Services, under which Avalon Place is managed, indicated that her business had a pro-life philosophy and decided to make the exception. And so he went there on a ventilator and being intravenously fed. And then on May 30th, just a short time ago, he died of natural causes at Avalon Place. Right. So you can see how complex this situation was. And what, of course, the newspapers don't talk about is the ethical dilemma that the professionals involved found themselves in, the physicians and the nurses, where our priority ethical statement is do no harm and act for the patient. But what is acting for the patient when there is no quality of life? See? What helped here, and a point that I wanted to make, especially for those of you who are working within a larger organization, is that ethics committees have really become a major asset. And I would guess, even if you're operating, say, out of a dentist's office, that there would be a way to develop an ethics consultation group that you could go to. In hospitals, now almost every hospital has an ethics committee. They are made up of different numbers of members. Different people are on them, and they have different functions. I will tell you that in most cases they are advisory. They do not make decisions. And when ethics committees were first beginning, there was some thought that they would actually make the decisions, but that's not so. They act in a consultation role, but they also have an educational role. What it does is take the decision on situations like life support or any ethical dilemma that you encounter out of your hands alone. I mean, in the end, you have to make a decision, but you have a group that you can go to who keeps themselves abreast of ethical issues and is hyper aware. And that's why I'm saying that, again, I don't know if there are informal groups that form, for example, for a dental hygienist, or it may be an interdisciplinary group. Perhaps if she's in a dentist's office and they have a plan that they will meet around ethical issues with the dentist and the other dental hygienists. But I'm saying something besides you left to question and fight this through on your own. Because you go to your code of ethics, you go to the legal directives, and they still don't give you an answer. And that's why getting the opinion, getting multiple points of view is critical to doing this. Having said that, what I've basically done is give you a case example of how, when you have ethical variabilities that are very serious, the ethics committee can be of assistance. I'm wondering if we can go back, and we have a little time, to the kinds of ethical problems or dilemmas that you are either encountering or expect to encounter, and what is your thinking, how do you think through these ethical dilemmas to reach a decision? So I'm wondering is anyone, well, I'm sure you have encountered ethical dilemmas. If you have been in a clinic, you have. And if you've practiced, for sure you have. Again, the level of, it depends how aware you are, and that will vary by person. But I would appreciate if someone who has had an ethical situation that was troublesome would describe it and then talk about how you go about working that ethical decision. Is someone willing to risk? Yes?
I don't know how horrible this is, but certainly was cause for us to question it. We have a program at the Alzheimer's Association called Safe Return. and it is a registry for people who may wander. And in this particular case, a gentleman just last weekend wandered away from his home.
Wait, can everyone hear her? Okay, good.
And he is working with the senior center. The senior center really keeps a close eye on this gentleman because the family is not taking the step to care for this gentleman properly. So I'm pleased to say that the senior center staff bring him lunch on a daily basis and really are stepping up to the plate where the family is not. So we got this gentleman on safe return, you know, a couple weeks ago, but he's not officially on.
What does that mean, on safe return?
Safe return is a registry for people who may wander. So
Mhm.
if this gentleman in the future were to wander away again, he would have identification product on him, and of course we could contact their first point of contact
Mhm.
due to that. It's a community awareness program in the respect that we do training with law enforcement, CPS, Viatrans, Good Samaritan, so on and so forth. In this particular case, this gentleman is not on our program yet. Paperwork has been filed, but he's not on it.
What, as a member of the Alzheimer's Association, what is your responsibility? What do you take to be your responsibility?
My responsibility, well, of course, to assist the family to, and/or the providers, which in this case is really the senior center. It was the senior center that called us and said, this gentleman is missing. So of course, our thing was to call the police, call Adult Protective Services, try to get in contact with the family members, of which they did, but again, the family members are not hands-on. This gentleman lives alone. So we tried to support the senior center employees on, you know, where do you go from here, what should you do, so on and so forth. But since he wasn't already on safe return, and of course we checked nationally to see if his kit had been mailed off yet, and so on and so forth, to cover that end, and of course it had not yet, but it just wasn't enough time.
But even if he had been located and brought back, that wouldn't solve the problem. So what are the kinds of questions from other people in the audience, what are the kinds of questions you would ask in terms of trying to decide what to do in this situation?
Well, if he's not safe and he's living by himself and his family isn't, if nobody's caring for him, has adult protective services involved.
Now, is he responsible for himself? Well, you'd have to have an assessment to determine that. If not, who is? Now, again, in other situations where there's even a question of that, the family steps in, but in this case, the family hasn't. And I'm guessing one of the problems is no one is responsible for this gentleman's well-being. And so he's wandering. I think your point was very well made, that the first thing would be to call Adult Protective Services. And your point was also wondering whether Adult Protective Services, how did you put it, is effective, was doing anything. The young lady in the green top. What did you say about Adult Protective?
I said as far as adult protective services was concerned, you would think that they would follow up on it. It almost makes you think that no one followed up on it because they're responsible to do something. The person is incompetent, so somebody has to do something in order to provide a safe environment.
Well, we say we have a safety nets, and those are the abuse hotline and the child abuse, the adult and the child abuse hotline. Now, what do you know from the little that there's been in the paper about those lifelines?
Undermanned, no money.
Yeah. And go ahead.
I think this brings up a point that I think these dental hygienists might experience, that there is abuse and there are diagnosable diseases that you can contribute problems to, but what we find is that self-neglect in the elderly is what is the most apparent. It's like might have lost the will to live, they just feel like they don't need care. And self-neglect is a big, big issue with our adult senior population.
And
And that's what's so difficult, is that they are not incompetent. They have their times when they're more cognitive than others, but
what we formally what we have to depend on is adult protective, child protective, but informally what we have to depend on, and we have more and more, is what I call informal case finders. And that can be anyone, you noticing if the child next door isn't being fed. But as dental hygienists, you are in an ideal place to be case finders. Because when you see that elderly person for their checkups, if you will note their dress, their mood, their hygiene, and what happens when you begin to notice changes. Say it's someone that you've seen for a while, and suddenly that person, you might notice it with their dental care, but you also notice that their hair hasn't been washed, and that's never been, this has been someone who's taken great pride in their appearance. It means that you could be a case finder, which means that you begin again to ask the questions, have you been well? Are you still living with your daughter? Has anything changed? And then linking them. What we also know is that at a time of undermanned services for adult and child protective, when a professional calls, I mean, this isn't the way it should be, but it is. If you call the hotline and identify yourself as a professional dental hygienist or social worker or nurse, what you report will have more weight. Now, again, I'm not saying that's the way it should be, but the reality is it is, and that allows you to advocate so that you may feel that your next step is to contact adult protective and provide them with the information that you've seen. I think, and ethically, the other piece is not only should we, but ethically we must, because of our code of ethics and our commitment to the well-being of our patients. But that's going above what the narrow definition of the job to be done is. And I say that to social work students a lot of times too. People come in and they have a need, and you help them meet that need, but do you ask, are there other things going on? Are there some other issues? Or do you just slot them in and slot them out? I think we need to do more than that, off of our commitment to the well-being of people. Yeah. Now we have, it's a little after 4, and we have 10 minutes for questions. I wonder if there are questions or comments, or if someone else has a situation they would like to bring to the group, or to respond even further in this situation with the man roaming, because there's still no solution. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I have something that's a little different, I guess, than speaking to the elderly.
So, and that's one that also occurs in other professions as well. What you're saying is it's not when you yourself fail to report, but when you see a dentist for whom you are working is not referring for proper care or treating an infection the way it should be treated. And you see this in hospitals, and you see it in a lot of places, and the question is, what do you do? That's right, when this is your employer. And it is beyond, there's one, the ethics, what is the right thing to do? but then you have to deal with the realities. This is my job. I need to earn money. I could make a lot of fuss and not have much result, but still jeopardize my reputation in the field. What does your code of ethics say in these kinds of situations, or does it address? Does your code of ethics address such a situation?
I think your first step would probably be to go directly to that person and see if you could resolve it. Say an infection control issue, say, notice this, I don't think we're doing our standard of care properly. What can we do to correct this here on our level? And then if nothing's done, then you take it to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
So always begin low key, try not to involve anybody if you don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
Try to keep from embarrassing anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But if that doesn't work, then you should.
Yeah. And what's the basis? What gives you the right? And that would rest, I'm guessing, in your ethics, your code of ethics. What gives you the right to make that, to take those steps?
I mean, that's it.
And acting in the best interest.
I think it's really hard for hygienists because hygienists are not allowed to diagnose disease. So if they see disease that's going undiagnosed, that can be a real situation for them.
Absolutely.
Maybe one of the things that most offices have is their weekly meeting, their weekly staff meeting, and at least with infection control and those kinds of things that always come up, those could probably be very easily handled there. But if you get to see patients on recall, then you can bring attention, a suspicious lesion, you can bring that to the attention of the dentist. Don't you think that that's fully acceptable, Susan, when a hygienist brings something to your attention because they're going to see that patient anyway? Dr. Stadtmiller is also a dentist, so I would imagine most of us would welcome having, someone picking up something we might have missed, or sometimes you're the first person to see it.
But, and I think that in that case, I think that is the appropriate step. And in that case, then there becomes no dilemma. But in one of the articles that I was reading about ethics in organizations, they were talking about a surgeon who had begun to have shaky hands and was in strong denial. And a nurse, and what was the nurse to do, knowing that there was a surgical accident which was not reported? And in some ways, it's a similar situation because as a dental hygienist, that's not your area of specialty. It belongs to the dentist. But the fact is, when you are there and you practice a long time and you are a good observer, you do pick up things. And what you hope is that the dentist for whom you work is as conscientious as
I've got a good story, especially since we
Give us
deal
a
with hygiene people.
See, so that, but building a working relationship so that you can do that is important. At the same time, if not, certainly in the social work code of ethics, we either do need to go the next step to report our employer, or we can leave we can't continue to work in an environment that is unethical. And I'm sure that you can't either. So that presents that either it's fixed or you need to look somewhere else. I really am hopeful that in most cases you're working with people of goodwill who want just as much as you the well-being of the client. And sometimes people do need reminders. Thinking of the dentist of the year. I mean, sometimes you need other eyes to remember that there are other eyes on you, and you can be those other eyes, just as the dentist is the other eyes on you. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
to